Hey guys, Effie here. Today I'm going to show you one way on how to use up those pesky scraps that you've accumulated in your stash. So I have a pile of watercolor paper scraps here, and what you want to do is look into your stamp stash and just look for a stamp that has smaller images. For me, I'm going to use our Charmed Wildflower stamp set, and I'm just going to pull out the smaller floral and leaf or foliage stamps, and I'm going to start gold embossing the images onto all of the scrap pieces. Generally, when I create floral clusters, I always like to create extra foliage or leaf pieces because I find that I need about 3 foliage or leaf pieces per main floral. So here you can see I have the 3 main florals embossed, but then I'm going to stamp a bunch of foliage bits because for me, I always need extra foliage pieces, and I find that when you're looking to make a foliage, or rather a floral cluster, a little bit more fuller, you can do so by adding more leaves or foliage bits without taking away from that main floral as the spotlight. One tip before you begin embossing, be sure to brush on some anti-static powder onto your paper so that you get some nice clean embossed images. You want to make sure that you do this before you stamp using the embossing ink. If you don't have one of those official Embossing Buddy products, you can always substitute by using kitchen flour or baby powder. So I'm just going to continue to finish my embossing, and I'm doing this in an assembly line style so that I can get all of my images embossed on these scrap pieces and then heat them all up at the same time. I find that I'm more efficient with my time if I do things assembly line style. So here I have all of my scrap pieces embossed with images. Wherever I can fit an image, I'm going to emboss a leaf or a little floral. So now let's get started with watercoloring. I'm using a wet in wet watercoloring technique. So that means that I'm applying water to my paper first, and then I'm applying wet pigment. After I apply some color burst pigment in cadmium red, I blend that color out to the edges of the petal, and then I added some Marsala color burst to the inner portions of that larger flower. With the smaller flower, I'm using a combination of, I think it's marigold color burst and the cadmium red color burst. Next, I applied the same technique to the foliage bits. I used a combination of lime color burst and chartreuse color burst for a hint of brightness. Once I finished painting all of the images, I made sure to dry them completely. Then I started die cutting each piece individually using the coordinating dies. It was a little bit of a process because there were so many images, but you know what? This is a really, really great way to use up those scraps because you have all these different size scraps and some like smaller scraps, and a great way to use them all up is to turn them into these smaller foliage bits that you can use for beautiful floral clusters. It's also a really nice way to get some crafty time in if you don't want to make a complete finished project. Sometimes your creative mojo has decided to take a vacation and you don't really have you're not really inspired to create something new or finish. So you can just sit down and start embossing and coloring something for a future project. But in this video, I am going to use those actual die cut pieces to show you what you can make using these finished beautifully watercolor pieces. So I took our anemone spray die and I die cut it from white cardstock. Look how gorgeous it is. It's very intricate and beautiful. I'm going to use Thermoweb's Ultra Bond Liquid Adhesive to apply this piece onto an A2 card panel. So here, if there are some pieces that you've missed, just make sure you have that metal tip on and you can get into those nooks and crannies and get the whole piece adhered onto your panel. Next, I'm going to start popping up my florals and leaf bits right over that anemone spray die cut piece, which gives it that beautiful and subtle tone on tone effect. It also adds texture to that background so that it's not just a plain, boring background. It gives it a little bit more interest without overpowering your project. I'm going to continue to pop up all my pieces, but I'm making sure to use that 3-to-1 ratio of leaves to florals so that you have a nice balance of color. If you have tweezers, by all means use them because they do help with arranging these smaller pieces. But if you don't have tweezers, you can just use your natural tweezers. Just use your hands. So I found that something was missing. So what I did was I took our double stitched cover plate die and I die cut this piece onto an A2 white card panel. Now what this die does is it cuts a bunch of frames at once. And this is the double stitch version. We have a double pierce version as well, but I decided to use the stitch version for this card. So now I'm going back and forth between the first and second die. Die cut. And I went with the second frame, the smaller frame. I cut off the left portion of the frame so that I could tuck this into the florals. If you know you're going to add this frame to your project, you want to do this before you add your floral clusters. It's much easier to pop up the frame first on your panel and then start popping up your florals and leaves on top of the frame. I did not know that I was going to add the frame to my card. This was impromptu, and that's the beauty of creating while you're filming. Next, I'm going to take one of the sentiments from our script word dies bundle. There are 6 words included in this bundle. You also have the shadow base die cut that you can also create. So you have the intricate word die and then the shadow base die. For this card, I decided to use the hello die. So I die cut this using some homemade glitter paper that I created using our Glossy Fine Gold adhesive paper. At first, I was just going to adhere the intricate sentiment onto the card, but I decided to die cut the shadow base as well because it was going to give that sentiment a little bit more stability as I adhered it onto the project, but it also adds some nice interest to the card overall. I used a double layer of foam tape to pop up the sentiment onto the card. Once I got the sentiment down onto the card, I pulled out some of our clear dewdrop enamel dots to embellish the card, and I just applied them in a visual triangle around the sentiment. Usually when I embellish a card, I follow that rule of 3 and the visual triangle. And my card is complete. I hope you guys enjoyed today's project and video and all the tips I've provided. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel because I update it regularly. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.